Senator Graham.
Thank you. What's the likelihood, in your view, that Moldova will be in Putin's crosshairs in the next year?
Senator, I think it is an area of his concern and emphasis. I think you are aware, and it's fairly open knowledge, that the forces in Moldova have been retrofitted with new equipment, et cetera, across the past year or so. And we see the sort of interest and rhetoric in that Transnistria region that is concerning. And now we...
Is it kind of almost what we saw in Crimea?
Senator, I don't think it's to that level yet, but it is the leading edge of these kinds of issues.
Do you agree with me it's most likely to occur unless he changes his mind through some recalculation of cost-benefit analysis of what he's doing in the Ukraine right now?
Senator, I agree that I think Mr. Putin is not done in Ukraine.
He's not done in the Ukraine. Moldova may be next. Let's talk about the Baltic states. Can you see a situation? Well, is it fair to say that the Russians are trying to stir up problems for the Baltic states with their Russian-speaking population? Is that ongoing right now?
Senator, I think some of the information outreach to these Russian speakers around Eastern Europe, specifically in the Baltics, is searching for the word. It is very good. As we talked about earlier, Senator, before you came with...
Good from a Russian point of view.
Sir, exactly.
Bad for us.
Very sophisticated was the word I was looking for, and I couldn't find it.
What's the worst case scenario for the Ukraine?
Senator, I worry a lot about the military problem. I worry almost more about their fiscal issues. We desperately need for Ukraine to be able to address the things that the people of Ukraine voted for in their last election, and that is to reform in a lot of ways. And second, they need to get their fiscal business in order, and it's hard to do when your military is in the field fighting.
So one way to bleed Kiev dry is to keep the fight. Keep them deployed.
Keep the pressure on, keep the Ukrainian military in the field. Investors are not going to want to invest in a situation where there could be a military conflict.
So that's one way of basically dismembering the Ukraine without having to move to Kiev itself, right?
I believe that's the case, Senator.
Mariupol, the port city, is there a way for the separatists, in collaboration with the Russians, to basically cut that port off from the Ukrainian government?
Senator, I believe that it is one of the courses of actions that may be considered. The town of Mariupol is a big one, about 500,000 people.
So you don't have to invade it, but they can basically isolate it.
That's correct, Senator.
And what would that mean for the economic survivability of the Ukraine?
Mariupol is very important to Ukraine because it is the port that most of their agriculture passes through. Because that area is the...
So if you were the separatists or Putin and you really wanted to punish the government in Kiev, that would be a move you would make?
It is a good option to do that punishment.
And would you agree with me, if he takes that option, that is just basically an all-out declaration of war through economic activity?
That is an incredibly big step.
Okay, so if that step happens, what should the Western response be?
Senator, I can't speak for all of the other nations, but I do know that most nations consider Mariupol an important point.
What will we do? Will they increase sanctions?
Senator, I can't answer for them. I think that's certainly...
Should we increase sanctions if they do this?
I think it's the most important that we maintain the ones we have first and not release them.
But do you see this as a provocation taking the whole conflict to a new level?
I do, Senator.
So there should be some red line regarding this port city?
Senator, I don't like to talk about red lines. If you draw
Well,
one,
I
you
just
have to-
want the committee and the country to start thinking about what I think is almost inevitable. And we need a plan, so you don't have to do it here, but I want somebody from the Pentagon to tell me what you would recommend if they did this provocative act of basically cutting off the port city, which would destroy the Ukraine in a different fashion. Finally, in 1 second, you can take a little bit of time. How does sequestration over time affect your ability to deal with the Ukraine, Russia, and all the problems you have in your backyard, from migration, from a exploding Mideast, the ability to defend our nation from a rogue missile attack coming from the Mideast, just a general ability of you to do your job, and what kind of signal would that send to NATO nations if we fully implement sequestration?
Senator, thank you for that question. Sequestration would be very detrimental to our ability to do our job forward. And I'll try to break it into a couple of things. If the chairman will give me a minute or two, I can't do this in 10 seconds. First example we talked about earlier, part of our budget and what we do in Europe is train our partners and allies. As we talked about before, the ability to train Georgians and Romanians so that they can serve beside us in places like Afghanistan. That money will be cut. Less Georgians will be trained, more Americans would have to go to the field. So sequestration affects our ability to train and equip our partners and allies. This also affects things as close to us as problems with having airfields open when we need them. The first BCA, the first $478 billion cut, is what brought us to having to make changes to things like lodges, like Marone, and only have Marone open during certain hours, which affects our ability to use things like the special purpose MAGTF, et cetera. And then finally, our own ability to train ourselves and to bring rotational forces into Europe. If we've talked earlier about how the rotational forces are part of a way that we solve our forward presence problem, sequestration would affect the funding for those rotational forces. A rotational force doesn't accomplish its objective unless it is heel to toe, no air, and fully funded.
Thank you for your outstanding service. You've done a good job for us.